The Observer.
Hello everyone, welcome on this rainy night. I wish I could say rainy and cold, but we're in the age of climate change and 2 degrees of warming. It's just a rainy night. Thank you very much for coming to The Review with The Observer. I hesitate slightly because this is not quite the same thing as the news meeting, which some of you may have been to, which is gamified a little bit, and my three guests have to pitch a story and one of them notionally leads the news. Here we're just going to go through the papers in somewhat more old-fashioned form. We're each going to pick one lighter story and one meatier story. But what's the same as the news meeting is, please, you guys, dive in, interrupt, raise a hand. I will try and look out for hands all the way through, not just at the end. If you think that we're being silly in our selection of stories, our discussion of the stories, or we're missing out stuff that is very important to you and you feel is undercovered, raise a hand, interrupt, and don't leave it to the end. So without more ado, let me introduce our guests. From my extreme left, Katie Riley, The Observer's data and graphics editor, and quite a regular on these things. Good to have you, and famous for the power of silence. Kerry Thomas. Kerry, what's your job title these days?
I actually truly don't know.
Like super executive editor.
Yeah.
And Chloe Hadjimatheou, investigative supremo, author of the Salt Path stories and many others. 28 years ago, last piece of preamble, 32. I got lucky and I got a job with the Times in LA without knowing anything about LA, and I learned two things there. One was, and I think quite salutary as a first job in journalism, that there journalists, especially print, are right at the bottom of the food chain. I resist using the word scum because that is self-loathing taken a little too far. But whatever else it breeds in you, it breeds some humility as a journalist. But the second thing I learned there, or the second impression that I got there after a few months, was how incredibly parochial news from London could seem, especially when it meant that they spiked your stories from LA. Today, I feel, is one of those days when people looking at London from abroad may think we are somewhat obsessed with our own news because, of course, we are about 24 hours into the story of the resignation of Tim Davie and Deborah Turness from the BBC. And we're at The Observer from last night when we pulled quite a shift up towards about midnight to get a piece ready for early this morning. We do think that it's a big story, and if you read the leader that is up on the website now, and we'll have more coverage throughout the week, various Observer writers will be explaining why. But I can't help thinking it doesn't necessarily look like that from elsewhere in the world. Anyway, I'm sure we'll come to that. First, though, you are required, dear guests, to tell me what has caught your eye that is less weighty, frivolous, frothy, trivial. Who wants to start? Katie?
Well, I feel like I may have not completely followed the assignment because my story is not actually that trivial. It was light, though.
Mm-hmm.
Lighter. Should I still
Go with it. Go with it, yeah.
Okay. So there's a story in The Guardian from Saturday. And it's about how single mothers, supposedly it's a trend, there's no data, but there's anecdotal evidence that solo mothers in China are in some large number teaming up to live together, and they're putting out ads for each other like, I have a kid this age, it would be nice to share a house with someone who has a kid of the similar age, I'm a single mother, and I just thought that was so nice.
It is nice, but
it's really nice.
but presumably also it's a function of a big and
Yeah,
rather
it's a
serious demographic.
Absolutely. I mean,
Or maybe I'm just assuming that people would
well,
like a different sort of family.
it is a function of, you know, rent and property prices, but I think it's also a function of loneliness and the need for community. And also the divorce rate in China is going up, like it is in the West, or has in the West, and it's going up in China now a lot as well. And I just think it's nice.
There was I leaping to the conclusion that it was a function of a shortage of men.
No, some would argue a surplus of men. It's actually a function of the surplus of men. Yeah.
I think this is really interesting. So when I was splitting with my partner as a single mum, a friend of mine was as well, and we did talk about doing that. Because London is crazy. Like, how do you survive in London? You know, it's impossible. Oh. And then at some point I sort of did the sort of 5 later steps in my head of having to watch somebody else's parenting style and deal with their kind of levels of cleanliness. And I just thought, actually, I think I'll make it work financially. It's okay.
And what is the dateline? Have we got other reporters based in China doing
from
that?
From Taipei.
From Taipei. Interesting.
But it is a story, it just says China. It doesn't say anything, it doesn't say mainland, it doesn't say Taiwan or...
That in
the
itself...
picture's in Nanjing, which is mainland, right? Mm-hmm. So...
But that in itself is fascinating. Almost all the Western correspondents who used to be based in Beijing and Shanghai have moved out,
Hong Kong.
Many of them to Taipei.
Can I read the last quote of
yeah.
the story to you? This is a beautiful, 300-word story. The house suddenly became full of life. 3 little girls running around laughing all the time. They're now surrounded by double the love.
Oh, lovely.
Isn't that
Okay,
nice?
great. And we presume there are sort of several 100,000 families like this in a country of 1.4 billion.
Probably.
Kerry?
Well, controversially, perhaps, for what's supposed to be a lighter story, I've gone for an obituary. But
depends who it is.
Because this was... So the obituary of James Watson in the Times, which is the only thing that made me laugh out loud. I most have been reading BBC stuff, to be fair, so I haven't read a lot. This is the only one that made me laugh out loud when I read it, because I think what you get into through it is the question of how do you deal with someone who is brilliant, discovers DNA, a fundamentally important discovery.
We have to insert a caveat there, of course.
Well, I will.
Okay,
get to that.
yeah.
But at the same time, it's clearly a truly awful human being. And the piece is sort of brilliantly structured. So you get sort of 2/3 of the way down the first column. And it drops this little hint when James Watson says, I knew many people, at least when I was young, who thought I was quite unbearable. Leaves that sort of hanging there. And then a few paragraphs later, Edward Wilson, the Harvard biologist, I've actually been in his lab once, lovely man, talks about James Wilson as the Caligula of biology. And then it just sort of slowly unravels this man from there, so that so the controversy that's well known about him is whether he stole an important piece of one of the great building blocks for his discovery of DNA, for which he won the Nobel Prize, particularly from Rosalind Franklin and her colleague Morris Wilkins, who worked for a different laboratory.
They worked down the road in King's.
They did. There are some quotes I will read out, and some I probably won't.
Chatham House rule, I mean, with grown-ups, mainly grown-ups?
Yeah. Well, so he can't stop for the rest of his life. He knows he's in trouble with Rosalind Franklin, but he later in life he says, unprovoked, in an interview where Rosalind Franklin comes up, he says, thought could not be avoided that the best home for a feminist was in another person's lab, which is where Rosalind Franklin was when he nicked her stuff. Then he sort of digs in. So later in the piece, he's quoted as saying, and forgive me, this is a direct quote, whenever you interview fat people, you feel bad because you know you're not going to hire them. And And then it leads up to 2007 when he gets into some properly nailed on racist stuff about intelligence, different intelligence across different ethnicities. He gets his fingers burnt in 2007 talking about that, but he comes back to it. He's like a moth to a flame. He comes back to it again in 2019 in a documentary, and it's that documentary which finally does for him, which apparently on the wall of one of his old universities, there's a space where his portrait used to be, which is still there. And at that point, he is finally sort of cut out. There's a
He's physically cut out of the portrait?
No, cut out of sort of good society,
Oh, right.
decent society. He writes this book called, there's a passage here about the book that he wrote called The Double Helix, which sort of encapsulates the whole Watson problem, where it says, the double helix is partial, bitchy, and occasionally unreliable. It's completely lacking in gravitas, skates over important details, and is full of irrelevancies. It is also brilliant, one of the finest popular science books ever written. So it goes on to sell 1 million copies, and some really important later scientists, particularly the woman whose name I've forgotten now, who discovers gene editing, says it's that book that drew her into science in the first place, because she suddenly realised it could be fun, it could be sort of intoxicating. And so for all the kind of massively flawed, massively important, hugely influential, and go figure. I think his luck is he makes his discovery really young, DNA, before he's got old enough and kind of loose-tongued enough for people to realise quite how ghastly he is.
Yeah.
So he does the important thing first, and then spends the rest of his life kind of undermining himself.
Or until people got to know him.
My James Watson trivia is, I've almost never had any scoops. And in fact, this is a scoop that wasn't a scoop because I did nothing with it. But around 2015, he was a guest at the Cheltenham Science Festival, which the Times sponsored. And he met up for the first and only time with Peter Higgs, who also won a Nobel a few years later for the Higgs boson, when the Higgs boson's existence was confirmed at CERN. And I happened to be there lingering when these two titans of science met, and I got a picture of them on my phone and thought, I sort of ran around like an enervated fly for a while thinking that must be something, and I never did anything with it. But anyway, I was there. What's your light story?
Mine
Yes.
is, it's this big feature in The Observer, actually, about Lily Allen and her new album that's out. I know it's light, but I think what's interesting about it is that it sort of starts digging into this, something that I think has been growing as a phenomenon, and Katie might want to pitch in on this, which is ethical non-monogamy and this idea of open relationships. And I don't know whether it's something that's got big now or whether it's people of my generation and my age, but it seems to have been picking up as an idea and a sort of practice. And I've always been interested in it because I'm never completely convinced, and Lily Allen is an example of this, that both parties are completely on board. My feeling is that one of the two people usually feels like opening up the relationship a lot more than the other, and the other is sort of dragged along kicking and screaming. Having said that, I do have some very close friends who've been in a long distance relationship, that is an ethical non-monogamous relationship, for a very long time. And then I was convinced that it could work if there was enough of a distance, but they've now fallen out over something. So it worked for quite a long time. I find it really interesting, and I do think that this sort of exploration of relationships and the different sorts of variants and forms that they can take is something that people have been discussing more and more recently.
And attaching new language to, yeah?
Oh,
ethical
it's
non-monogamy
huge.
is a relatively new form of words for something that's kind of been...
As people call
E&M,
it.
yeah.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. E&M. And
But I mean, Jane Austen must have had a phrase for it. Shakespeare must have had a phrase for it.
I don't know whether the whole kind of like ethical non-monogamy is very much, the ethical bit of it is very, very strict.
It's a bit self-righteous, isn't it? Like,
So if you take the ethical...
We're non-monogamous, but we're ethical about it. Like,
Yeah.
It means everyone's on board, nobody's lying to anyone.
yeah, but as we see, the reason I was going to pitch in was not because I'm in an ethical non-monogamous. But it's just something lots of people are involved in.
Do you buy it? Do you buy the ethical part of it? I mean, if you assert it, does that make it so? Or are you just having your cake?
I think it, like this shorthand sort of means like we have rules, like there are boundaries, and you're not just cheating on your partner, which we were talking about in the pre-show discussion downstairs. How like it seems to be more prevalent in certain communities. Like I think gay men in particular have had like open relationships sort of openly for a long time and didn't call it this, but yeah, I don't know.
Are there any ethical non-monogamists here who'd like to raise a hand and say what it's like?
Unethical,
Paul.
Charles. Unethical, definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with Chloe, though. I think the major issue with this is that the term monogamy comes into the language. And that is, by definition, saying we believe in this togetherness to the exclusion of everybody else, but now we're going to break it and go off and do something else. And I think that you do get this imbalance. I think that there is usually one or other person. Otherwise, it's a polyamorous relationship or a polygamous relationship, which is an entirely different thing, where you have solid relationships outside of it. But the notion of a monogamous relationship where you decided to go, we're going to get together as a couple to the exclusion of everybody else, but now we're in that, one of us invariably is going to cheat on the other, but we're going to say it's fine because the other person is accepting.
Okay, so you've brought up the P word, polyamorous. I have a friend whose daughter is grown up, so I feel slightly bad talking about it, but it'll all remain anonymous, and of her own volition got into a relationship with a man who was quite open about wanting to remain polyamorous. What is the difference? This is about language. What is the difference between, with your eyes open, going into a relationship with a polyamorous person or
Totally
going into...
different terms.
Well, I know, but I'm asking what the relationship's like.
They mean different things.
Well,
so
go on, how?
ethical non-monogamy means that you're paired as a couple, but you both sleep with other people. Polyamory is more than one coupled relationship. So you're in love and are faithful to more than one person.
Ironically, the one with non-monogamous in it generally means that you are paired off with one other person. But you're not monogamous, but you kind of are monogamous.
So the physical coupling that you do with other people in an ethical non-monogamous relationship is meaningless, and you...
Yeah.
It's monamorous, single love.
Is that a thing, monamorousness?
Oh, okay. There
Non-monogamous would, I think, generally refer to some couple which you would say, like, you would only love of one person. Whereas polyamorous would be a love of multiple people.
I agree.
But it's just you like have physical things with more than just that person.
Okay.
I mean, I think one thing that I have seen in practice that has worked more, I think, and I've seen among friends of mine in a more long-term capacity, are couples for whom the sexual attraction has completely died, but they really respect and care for each other deeply and love co-parenting and living together. And they've come to an agreement where they have one other boyfriend or girlfriend each, and they still want to live together and parent together and have their household together and live in that way, but the sexual aspect of their relationship is completely gone, and they each have a partner outside the house.
So it's like Andrew and Fergie.
Oh,
But aren't they divorced? Or no?
Yeah, they're divorced, but co-parenting, yeah, love it.
Well, their children are parents.
They are now, but...
But look, I think we can see from your face that
Co-grandparent?
the secret subtext of this whole thing is that the purpose of these events, which we didn't tell you before you came, is to ease Giles gently into the 21st century, or at least as close to it as we can get.
Yeah, okay. so long as it serves a purpose. Well, I have a properly, well, actually quite a heavyweight story. The Star was, full disclosure, I think a bit late to this. The Daily Mail got there first and the Mirror. It's about the tallest Tory in the country. The headline is, "I want to be giant of politics." This chap's name is James McAlpine. He's 7'2", and he was apparently a big story at the Tory conference, which was obviously in need of big stories. But it's so great, first of all, to be able to just, hold a newspaper and turn easily to the story. Oh God, I could before. Maybe it's fallen out here. Hold on. No, that's a different story that I wanted to talk about. Anyway, Britain's tallest Tory has vowed to become a political giant. James McAlpine, 7'2", is determined to take control of number 10. I assume, by the way, that he was the scion of the Robert McAlpine construction dynasty. He's not. He was born on a council estate in Scotland. But he did give the editors of The Star a fun day. In order to sort of catch up with the story, they invited him over to their offices in Canary Wharf and photographed him with all their reporters, than whom he is really much taller. Here he is with some of the editorial gang, with James Titch Caven at our Canary Wharf HQ. There he is. This story is by James Caven, 5'8" on a good day. James McAlpine, 7'2", believes he's got what it takes to hold high office, but despite his lofty ambitions to enter number 10, he insists his head isn't in the clouds. The 22-year-old, dubbed the never-ending Tory, visited the Daily Star's HQ in Canary Wharf. I'm trying to get myself out there as much as I can into the political world. Dream high, dream big. And so it goes on. Terrific stuff. And he really does make everybody at the Star look very, very short. I just rather liked the sort of unapologetic, what is it, sizist, or is it height triumphalist approach to the story? Is it okay with you? Should they have done a sense check?
Am I your woke correspondent?
Yes.
No, I was just wondering if they were using some sort of weird lens. But
No, he really is.
They're using perspective
the
a
main one
bit, aren't
looks
they?
like
Yeah.
quite straight on.
It's 7'2". Right. To the more serious business. Do you want to start us off, Kerry, on... I know what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember a day when, apart from The Star, I think every other paper's led on the same story, isn't it?
Yeah.
And for those days, I don't think there's any point choosing one particular front page because they're all saying more or less the same thing. So yes, the BBC, I think. So confession, I used to work there for quite a long time. Chloe did too. For how long?
18 years.
Yeah. So I was there for 24.
Some of which you were editor of the Day programme, some of which you were editor of Panorama. Panorama is at the very centre of this story.
So I obviously know some of the characters involved, and I was there for a few crises as well, from Hutton, way back when, Savile. So I know what it feels like inside when those places really start to wobble. And suddenly this institution that's felt rock solid for so long begins to feel very shaky indeed, and people behave in the sort of strangest ways. So the internal politics comes out and judgments become unreliable.
Were you surprised? Did it feel like a big enough wobble to topple the top people?
I think that's one of the surprises, that it in and of itself, absolutely not. That which is why I didn't see it coming at all. When I got a call yesterday saying this had happened, I nearly fell off the chair because it didn't have any of the. You can see the gravity of some of the other things that, the Hutton inquiry or the Savile accusations and all of that. This had none of that feel about it, which is why I think the job of trying to understand the sequence of events that led up to what happened yesterday is in a way more interesting because it's less obvious. And so I think you have to. So I think the way we pitched it this morning in the leader was political interference in the BBC, and I think in the end that's still the most useful way of understanding what has happened, but not political interference just in a particular moment, not just in the last week, but a history that goes back quite a few years and has manifested itself in different ways. So that you have to look at the level of the number of political appointments to the BBC's board. They've always been the chair of the board has always been politically appointed. There are also 4 non-execs who are politically appointed directly by, it says the Secretary of State, but in fact the Prime Minister. I think up to and including David Cameron, there was a sense that the sort of old, sort of gentlemanly approach to British institutions still held good. And that, what did Peter Hennessy call it? The sort of old chums club or something. I can't remember. There was a phrase that Peter Hennessy came up with. And so, talking to someone last night who used to work with David Cameron, he said it was very assiduous in not putting people into those positions who would actively try to undermine the BBC from within. But that changed in this person's view with Boris Johnson. And the appointments, so what we heard from the internal discussions was that there was a rebellion within the board. So I'll try and do this a bit more cleanly. The story rattled around for days. This Prescott report Prescott dossier that we can talk about its significance and where it sits in the scheme of things. But it rattles around for days. Last Monday, so a week ago, Deborah Turness, the head of news, had drafted an apology to say we got the panorama wrong.
We should say that, I mean, if you've been under a rock or on holiday, this is a panorama about Trump's speech on January the 6th, 2021, which
It wasn't even really about that. I mean, that was incidentally, it was looking at the possibility of a Trump second term and trying to figure out what he might do with it. And it used that speech as a piece of evidence in building that, in looking at that. So a week ago, we got to the point where the BBC's head of news had drafted an apology that was then due to be sent out by the chair of the BBC board to the head of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, who'd asked for an explanation. What happens then is, for some reason, Samir Shah, the chair, shares that draft with the rest of the board, and the rebellion that says, no, we're not going to send it out in our name, is led by 4 politically appointed BBC directors. And as a result of that, there's then nothing happens. No statement is sent out. The BBC just goes into a state of paralysis.
Because they didn't think it had gone far enough in its apology.
Yeah, I think there were different motivations. So one of the non-exec directors, the politically appointed ones, is highly motivated from a sort of gender critical perspective about that whole debate about trans rights. And so she felt that while we're apologising for this panorama, we should also apologise for these other things that we've been accused of to do with the treatment of the sort of trans rights issue,
which were also highlighted in the Prescott report.
And so there was that demand that we while we're at it, let's apologise more broadly. And there were others who felt that it didn't go far enough for other reasons. So there's then this vacuum into which the White House jumps, not least, so that by this Saturday, 2 days ago, what had been a manageable problem, the BBC simply said, hands up, we got this wrong, actually even before last Monday. If it had just said the panorama edit was wrong and shouldn't have happened and we regret it, the world would have shrugged and moved on. So as ever in these stories, Chloe will remember very well, there's always a degree of sort of BBC incompetence in the way that it handles things that exacerbates the original question. Deborah Turness then decides on Saturday that she's going to resign. Tim Davie wakes up at 6:45 on Sunday morning and says that he too has decided to resign.
Is that detail from reporting, or do you have the time he woke up?
I'm told it was 6:45 on
yourself,
Sunday
okay.
morning.
I don't think he slept.
No. And then for some reason I don't understand, nobody seems to go back to Deborah Turness and say, please don't resign now, because a double resignation will turn a huge problem into a real crisis for this place. Nobody does that, and so they're both allowed to leave, and the BBC is now, I think, in a heap of trouble.
So you mentioned that in that vacuum, the White House jumps in. That is in the form of Caroline Leavitt, Trump's spokesperson, saying the BBC is a propaganda network for fake news and always spoils our day when we come to London, because we turn on the telly in our hotel rooms and we have to watch this fake news. Apart from that, and then Trump has since obviously jumped in on Truth Social and crowed over the resignations and claimed them as his own scalps. Apart from that, why is this a big international story, if it is?
I don't think it, apart from that, I don't think it is. I mean, I haven't looked at coverage in France or Germany or anywhere else, but I suspect up to that point it's probably not playing around the globe, because I mean, there's an eternal underlying interest in the BBC, so it's probably getting picked up here and there. But I don't think it had the makings of, one of those sort of BBC scandals that we remember so well.
But if our argument, sorry...
I just wanted to say, I would be really, really interested to know, from the rest of the room, what you've taken from this story, whether you care as much as people whose pension depends on the place do, or whether you think the impartiality of the BBC is really an issue here, or whether it's the accuracy of the BBC, or whether you buy the idea of political interference, or there's a hand. Yeah,
Peter. Tell us your name.
Peter Grimsdale. I worked inside the BBC a while back. When I was the last there, it was just almost the turn of the century where I was inside it. And I couldn't help feeling, as I kind of moved, I had a bit of a more senior job, that there were layers and layers of people. It was very opaque, and it kind of infantilized a lot of people on the ground for doing the actual coal-face work. And that's the feeling I had when I left at that time. And reading about everything today, I felt like this is an organisation with layers and layers that infantilized. I feel like nothing has changed, and it's very much about the organisation. And the BBC is so adept at making a small thing happen, to just metastasize into a massive thing. Emmy, you're familiar with those scandals. And it just wearies, because I'm a big defender. I'm always writing to the letters, trying to defend the BBC, and it's tricky. But because I just believe in it, like lots of us do, because it's amazing that it's there, and it's still there now. And meanwhile it's getting 11.5 million for traitors.
Yeah.
It's still doing this incredible broad church public service job. What I think is possibly even more depressing and disturbing to me is that on top of all these layers, they have some kind of outside, this guy Prescott, is some kind of outside editorial scrutiny. Enough scrutiny, surely, because I think too much scrutiny just makes people take their focus away, because they think, someone else is going to look at this.
I used to find, if you asked the question in sort of some large BBC meeting about who's responsible for this story or cleaning up this problem or whatever it is, one of two things happened. Either no hands would go up or 12 hands would go up, and you were basically in the shit either way, because either responsibility was so diffuse that it didn't really matter, or no one was prepared to take it at all, and then you were in trouble that way.
But Peter, you suggest that this is an example of a small thing becoming a big thing. But if Kerry is right, if the leader we wrote is right, then what's at stake here is the independence of the BBC in the face of concerted political interference over a fairly long period. That surely is a big thing.
Yeah, that's a big thing. But in a way, so I mean, I was inside there as a programme maker when the whole thing happened, where John Burke was parachuted in from Margaret Thatcher was was coming in all guns blazing. I can't remember which Director General it was had to stand down. Michael Checkland and John Burke came in, and there was going to be a root and branch, mission to explain all that malarkey about changing how the customs and practices of the BBC Current Affairs, we all moved on. This isn't obviously the novelty of this one is that the President of the United States is now involved. I never quite had that before, but huge bust-ups with the royals. Margaret Thatcher was always gunning for the BBC, and you constantly felt that it was under threat all through. When I was going way back, but in the 80s there was always that nagging threat, that the Tories were coming for you, even though the same really real effort to be really balanced always applied. I don't know, so it doesn't answer your question, but I just find this Prescott factor completely bizarre.
He's an interesting figure because he was, some of you will have read this, but what the sort of central character in the view of the current problems that sees it as politically motivated is Robbie Gibb. So Robbie was a Newsnight producer, went on to run political programmes at Westminster for the BBC and left to become Theresa May's spokesperson in Downing Street. And then was part of the slightly opaque team that bought the Jewish Chronicle, and then was appointed to the BBC board by Boris Johnson, and from the start has been on a mission to criticise and offset what he says is the BBC's liberal bias from within, and has really sort of redefined how far a member of the board is prepared to go to do that. So whereas, when I was making programmes, the board felt, you'd hear from them, by carrier pigeon now and then, but they were quite a distant thing. Whereas Robbie will have, has appeared in sort of, while programmes are on air, to pass comment, has actively opposed certain editorial appointments, which is a job of the executive, not of the board. And so, and a lot of that happened under the chairmanship of Richard Sharp, who'd come in from Goldman's with a very different kind of ethos and didn't see a problem with the way that Robbie was expanding that role. So it's then Robbie who brings in Michael Prescott, an old friend of his, and commissions him to write these reports. And what seems to be the case is, and he commissions him to write a lot of different reports about different aspects of BBC coverage. What appears to be the case is that individually, each report was fairly balanced, but within each of them, there were 3 or 4 observations that were really difficult for the BBC if they were taken out of that context. And the dossier that Michael Prescott then produced, which somehow was linked to the Daily Telegraph, is a compilation of those filleted, difficult bits, all lumped together, stripped of the wider context around them.
I feel like the fact that it was linked to the Telegraph should be an interesting point in and of itself, shall we say. The fact that that is the paper that got that dossier.
I think it's really interesting as somebody who was never, and very concertedly never, an editor or anything above reporter. That's all I've ever done, and that's all I've ever wanted to do. Looking at this, I immediately, first of all, I saw this, edited Trump clip, which was quite obviously an absolute, terrible thing to do, and immediately a sackable offence. But then I looked deeper, and of course, this isn't journalists sitting in New Broadcasting House who've done this. This is a private company that the BBC have hired, October Films, who've spliced together this clip. And as an editor, Kerry, I don't know what you think, but you get the script in front of you, and it would have been pored over by editors, by lawyers, by editorial policy, which looks at the balance and the fairness and all of these things. And they wouldn't have seen this, I'm guessing, this clip sliced together. It would have been a script thing at the top. And you wouldn't think to ask, have you taken this out of context? Because it's so fundamentally obvious that you don't do that you probably wouldn't have asked, have you cut this clip together? And so a normal response to this would be, this is a terrible mess. The BBC absolutely does not condone this. We'll never be working with this production company again. End of story, move on. And it's been turned into something which to me feels deeply unfair, because this is a huge organisation. Bits of it work fantastically well, bits of it do need reform and care and changing. But there have been, over the last 2 years since the Gaza conflict started, loads of reports about how the BBC is anti-Palestinian. Nobody's resigning over those reports. Suddenly this, anti-Israel bias, apparently, and there may well be problems within the Arabic service. I haven't looked at it closely enough, but I don't believe that the way that it's been sold wholesale about the entire organisation, these little nitpicky things, they've gone in and looked at a giant organisation and found problems in bits of it, but then basically thrown the entire organisation to the wolves, which I think is not fair at all.
Yeah, of course.
Do you not think it's a bit like death by 1,000 cuts, to use the phrase? Everything spliced together. It feels like this individual Prescott has been put in as a device, and this is just waiting for the opportunity to then amplify the impact of what he says a lot further out. And the putting the petrol has only added fuel to the fire from the White House.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a degree of that. So, I spoke to someone last night who Robbie Gibb spoke to a year and a half ago, and said, if I don't, and this is a direct quote, if I don't get what I want, I will blow the BBC up. And so there's been a concern about his agenda, but then it's kind of to Chloe's point, it's incumbent on the BBC not to make that too easy, because I don't think the problem is necessarily independent production companies. Most I forget what proportion, but most panoramas are made by independent production companies, and so you've got to find, if that's the case, you've got to find ways of dealing with those people and maintaining the same standards that you have inside. So that's a management problem rather than a core issue. I think the reason this slipped by is probably because by the time Panorama, that clip wasn't some major revelation. It was just a bit of background, sort of narrative building on the way to the story they wanted to tell. And I think what it reflected was what was by then a commonly held view about the meaning of what Trump had said on January the 6th. And so, it wasn't interrogated closely because it was a good fit with most people's idea of what happened on that day.
How did it become, who discovered that minute, that
So we know that now because Michael Prescott, who we've just been talking about, who's brought in by Robbie Gibb, then employed a former BBC journalist called David Grossman, a well-respected guy who used to work on Newsnight, to dig deeper into programmes or issues that Michael Prescott, thought there was a problem with.
So it was a result of...
Michael Prescott watched the panorama. He thought it was inherently imbalanced because there were 10 anti-Trump voices and 1 pro-Trump voice within it. Oh. He asked David Grossman to look at it more closely, and it was Grossman then who finds this particular problem. But go on, there's a question over there, I think.
Yeah.
Hello, my name's Steve McCauley. I actually spent 4 years at the BBC until about 2005 in strategy. And as it happens, I've written a little bit about this January the 6th aspect for a book. So I know the story quite well about what Trump said and what he didn't say. And it's clear that the edit misrepresented the timing. But there's no question that Trump did incite violence on that day. There's no question. And the thing that I'm concerned about is we've become so obsessed with this BBC issue, which clearly is a big issue for the BBC and it's clearly a big problem, is that we somehow seem to have accepted the idea that Trump is somehow now exonerated by this edit. It's not true, okay? If you look at the whole thing, there were times when Trump actually said, we'll march on the Capitol and we'll do it peacefully. He did say that. But later he said, you'll fight and fight and fight and fight. And the message they heard was, go and fight like hell and stop the certification of the election. That's what the crowd heard. So if in the process we're going to somehow accept that Trump made a perfect statement, no. And I hope the BBC and others don't somehow crouch away from challenging what really happened on that day and continue to hold him to account. This is on the day, by the way, that he's just issued pardons for a whole load of the people that you might regard as co-conspirators like Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows and others. That happened, it was announced today.
Well,
So-
he tried to, but he tried to pardon a bunch of people who were convicted of state crimes, which you can't do.
Yeah, but he's pardoned them for
Yeah.
federal crimes. Obviously, he can't
Yeah.
for state crimes.
Yeah.
But it's symbolic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, of course.
So I think, Steve, I agree with that. I think that, again, the sort of further problem that Panorama has made for itself is that edit was one problem. The other problem, which I think in some ways people within the programme think might have been bigger, was that they misrepresented the timing of when the Proud Boys marched on the Capitol. That happened before any incitement from Trump.
Yes.
And the programme editing made it look as if it was a consequence of that.
Yes.
And so if it was just one slip, that would have been one thing. I think two looks more problematic.
And of course, what he didn't do was call off the riots. That was the
Yeah,
other thing.
that
What
too.
happened, he did nothing to stop it from happening.
Didn't call in the
The
National
problem is when
Guard.
you get these mistakes, it ends up undermining the bigger message, which is why something like this is so difficult. When you've got a really important story like that to tell, these tiny little things are the things that get picked up on and used against the overall message. But just, I mean, for people like you guys who've worked at the BBC, and I have to say it's a very delicate thing, because I don't know whether Kerry feels like this, but I slag the BBC off and the way that it's dysfunctional all the time, but I can't bear anyone else doing it. It's like family, you know. But I have to say there were moments when I first started and I was a junior reporter and I was editing clips of George Bush for the Bulletin, and I was trying to make them fit in my time slot. I was slicing out bits of silence between his sentences, and we had this long debate about whether I was making him look smarter by doing that, and that I shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah.
That was problematic. I couldn't cut even silences out. So I mean, an edit like this
so
is
quaint. Now thinking like that sounds so quaint.
Before we run out of time, your so-called meaty story,
I can get through it quick.
Chloe, wasn't it related?
Not
No, go ahead then.
really.
Go
Not
ahead
really.
then.
So I love this story because my favourite kinds of stories are the ones where I just think, oh my God, there's so much more to dig into here. And this is a story in The Guardian, and it is about somebody who on the surface seemed to be a Russian activist who had fled Russia. He was related to Alexei Navalny's group, the Anti-Corruption Federation and Open Russia, and linked to lots and lots of Russian opposition groups. And he fled Russia and basically got asylum in Poland. And then something weird happens. He's linked somehow to a package, a parcel, that's found to contain explosives. And the police in Poland start looking into him. And it turns out he was FSB the whole time. So he admits now that he was compromised at some point and coerced, is the word that he uses, into working for the FSB and spying on opposition activists, and eventually just started getting paid for it and seemed to have been doing it for quite a long time. But his trial is just beginning, but he seems to have spilled the beans on the whole thing. And I just see dead man walking. That's what I see when I look at that article.
On trial in Poland.
In Poland,
But
for
in
being
your
a spy.
view, at risk if he stands next to an open window,
Or drinks tea, or
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
which presupposes extensive FSB capabilities within Poland.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I often think that, the rest of Europe, I mean, Poland probably not so much, but a lot of Europe, including here, we're not really aware of the fact that we're at war with Russia. Russia thinks it's at war with us. I don't think we feel like we're at war with Russia, but I think Russia's tentacles reach pretty far, and we should be more aware of it.
Are you surprised that 22, 23, 24, 25 years plus into this war, there haven't been more stories like this?
There have been a few. They just keep cropping up in isolated cases, and some of them have been astounding, of these sleeper agents that have had entire families and their children don't know about it.
In Spain, or was it Argentina, or
Yeah,
somewhere like that?
yeah.
And they didn't speak Russian.
It's just
and they
phenomenal
came
stories
back.
about people who've been undercover for, decades.
And of course there was the helicopter pilot who defected very conspicuously, went to, I think, a town called Villajoyosa on the Costa Blanca.
And died.
He didn't just die, he was gunned down, and then whoever did it drove his own car backwards over him. Yes, fascinating. Was there a story that we haven't got to that you wanted to tell us about?
Briefly. I actually had two, but I'll just choose one of them. One of them I was going to rant about sort of general innumeracy and our inability to understand that national trends are different across localities, but I think I just did that.
You just did that. Great.
There was an interesting story in the FT today about how the UAE is tempting more people who were kind of who have been living in Singapore, specifically Chinese people, like people who have Chinese citizenship but are very wealthy, living in Singapore, tempting them to the UAE.
How?
Sort of more looser residency rules. Singapore is because it's such a small nation state and it's kind of an authoritarian state, correct? It has pretty strict rules about immigration and the UAE obviously is trying to tempt lots of rich people from lots of different parts of the world to come to Dubai and I mean obviously taxes as well, but Singapore has some pretty good tax breaks for rich people. But yeah, it just made me think about we talk a lot about the kind of we talk a lot about the geography of climate change and migration due to climate change, but there's also this and this isn't totally new, but I think it's possibly becoming something that's a little bit different. There's also this kind of geography of the uber wealthy, which used to be really concentrated in places like Hong Kong and Switzerland and New York and London, and now we're getting these other sort of offshoots of places that people who are uber wealthy are moving to, and some of those are people who, some of those are Russians who are fleeing the war, who can't go to New York, who can't go to London, and are going to places like Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo and wherever else. But yeah, it got me thinking about how we might do a data piece about where people are moving for like golden visas, golden passports, and.
Of course, one of the reasons for Russians moving to Buenos Aires is it's more welcoming for LGBTQ plus than anywhere else. Did you read that?
Well, that is true. Yeah, definitely more welcoming than the UAE.
But I'd love to see the data on who's going to the UAE, not just Dubai but Abu Dhabi as well, and why? Because of course it's not. I mean, yes, Russians. You've just told us Singaporeans, but a lot of people from here as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at data about who purchases, like for a story months ago about who purchases, non-residents who purchase homes in the UK, and the second highest residency, non-local residency, was the UAE, and it turns out, of course, that a lot of those people are actually British citizens who live in the UAE and have second homes in the UK, which is interesting.
I feel that we should make sure that we have a few minutes left before 7:30 in case people want to come back to what we think is the big story. In fact, let me. I was gonna draw your attention to a Telegraph story about car theft, but I think that's a waste of time. I think. Yeah. Let's hear what you think we should have been talking about. You, sir, with your hand up and the microphone.
It was interesting discussion earlier about the BBC, and especially from people who've been on the inside, both in the panel and in the audience. But I think one of you asked the question of, what's the international coverage been like? And for me, that's been quite telling, in that from what I've seen and people I've spoken to over the weekend, it's not that big a deal. It just seems like there's this resignation that, of course, media institutions are going to be politically motivated, and maybe the BBC was the last bastion of that. So I just think the international reaction from what I've seen and from what I've heard is quite telling. So as big a story as this is for us all, I don't know. That's just. I think it's quite interesting.
I think that's true, but I do think that so like American papers are not covering this story with any sort of gusto because the Democrats are trying to cave on the shutdown. So that's the biggest story. But the BBC is internationally quite. When you look at the data on who's trusted as a source of news, the BBC is really trusted above almost all other news organizations internationally across borders.
Second to the Weather Channel in the United States.
Yeah, in the US, it is seen as like, because it's foreign, it's seen as kind of like the most impartial source of news. So people do definitely know what it is in the States and also obviously in Europe and the rest of the world because of the World Service.
You were making the point earlier that I'm sure there's like an international shrug that's going on. I'm sure the New York Times will cover it quite big at some point, I'm sure. But generally speaking, there's probably a shrug around the world. You were sort of coming up with that idea earlier on that there might be a sort of generational shrug as well, that actually, if you're under 35, even in this country, maybe actually this thing is not a big central part of your life in the way that it is for, older people.
Yeah, I mean, I think people, let's hear from another young person in the audience.
Well, I was just about to say the same. Sorry, hi, I'm Felicia. This slipped me by completely. I had absolutely no idea this was happening until about half an hour ago.
Wow.
So it's all been mumbo jumbo, the whole thing is basically, yeah.
So what do you think we should have been talking about?
I mean, no, it's genuinely really interesting. It's more interesting actually not having heard about it, just how big of a news story it is. But
we
truthfully,
think it is. Yeah.
I'm just trying to get on the housing ladder. I've got different priorities. I'm not reading about the BBC.
But maybe there is a tough truth that all you lifers, ex-lifers, need to absorb, which is that people are watching less of the BBC.
Yeah.
I know that I am. But Paul, what do you...
Yeah, so it was really interesting. The BBC decided to go on TikTok last year. And one of the reasons, the major driver for that was that they were saying that there was no source that people were getting their news from that was legitimate. And for years they said, we're not going on TikTok, we're not going on TikTok. They have 11 million followers on TikTok. So it's probably the most watched. But the team that develops TikTok news for the BBC is an entirely different team from everything else. So it's kind of World Service, it's kind of Red, if you know where Red came from, the technology department. And they've kind of blended together. And what they do there is so interesting in that space. And the reason they're there is for exactly Felicia's point, is that they don't get them anywhere else. They don't get a young audience.
Anybody else for anything else? What? Yes, you, sir. Let's get... Yeah, great.
My name's Matt. It is a very interesting story, I think, and I think there's actually a lot of weight to it and people should be thinking about it because it is basically the latest in the culture war angle vibe, whatever you want to call it. And it's someone pointed out death by 1,000 cuts. It's that people, particularly right-wing press, sensing blood. A lot of American press don't really like the BBC. Your Fox News, the ilk. GB News, for them this is a prime opportunity to discredit the organisation, regardless of what you think of it, and assert themselves as more authoritative voices. And I think the Trump administration, like you pointed out earlier, this gives credence to what Trump's been saying for ages about himself, which is, oh no, I didn't do that, I was actually mistaken. It's legitimising his grievances, and that's why he's pushing this so hard. It's why it's being pushed so hard. It's because it's part of that grander narrative of mainstream media is fake, listen to this media instead. Okay, the clock has ticked round to 7:30. I'd just like to come back in closing to your point, Steve, about and you echoed it. What's an echo that comes before the point is made? Prefigured it by suggesting that the edit on that Panorama show wasn't that serious because it reflected what most people by that time thought had happened. But isn't it, and I just put this out there, isn't that a very dangerous suggestion? Because if you do
take account of the fact that the edit missed out Trump's urging of the crowd to be, quote, to go peacefully and patriotically, then what happened next is less of a mystery. What happened next is that for much of Biden's term in office, the federal court tried to prosecute Trump and others for January the 6th. Obviously, many of them did go to jail, but the prosecution of Trump himself failed utterly. And go on.
It's more complicated than that.
Go on.
I mean, Merrick Garland basically decided not to prosecute him. The people that actually prosecuted Trump for January 6th and the stuff around January 6th were state prosecutors. There is the January 6th case, yes, but a lot of that was held up in the court, which had nothing to do with the actual, there's like constitutional claims about whether or not he could be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. That is what stopped that from going through. It wasn't.
Okay, you two both obviously know more about this than I do, but I think, go ahead.
I may have not said it very clear, but I wasn't trying to say that.
Okay.
What I was trying to say was that I could understand why the edit wasn't spotted by the Panorama editor, because it fitted with the narrative that was commonly understood at that point. So I can completely imagine myself in the editor's chair sitting
right,
there
okay.
and not seeing that as a problem because at some level I'd kind of understood it.
But isn't that fascinating? That narrative is a false narrative.
But it's not. It's not. That's the point. It's not that. It's not what he said at that time, but the overall message from that speech was not go peacefully. It was, we're going to the Capitol, don't care what happens to Mike Pence, see you later, and we're going to, he said that he wasn't going to do the thing that we wanted him to do, and that's too bad for Mike Pence. I don't know what happens if we find him there, and do whatever you want, but we're going to you go to the Capitol and just show that you're upset about it. Like there's like we're acting like just because he said the word "go peacefully" means that he meant go peacefully. He didn't call the National Guard, Giles.
I always end up in these conversations invoking my Republican in-laws. I won't do it again. All I can say is that they take a diametrically opposite view.
That doesn't mean
and
that
it doesn't
right.
make them right, but it does help us understand what's happening there, to know that there are tens of millions of people who would listen to this conversation and put us all in the same echo chamber and say you're wrong.
Have you watched the whole speech, beginning to end?
No.
I just think you're overcomplicating this whole thing because the Daily Star has just distilled it into BBC boss quits over man baby. I think that's it.
And on that note, we'll call it a day. Thank you. You may find some tin canned wine still left in the jars. Thank you very much, Kerry, Katie, Chloe.
Thank you.
The Observer.